Taking care of land turns into big business. Being a noble becomes more like being a business person, managing men and land. But he's a Middle Ages style manager. Can we get back to those castle shots?
Ah, so at least nobles really did live in castles. We may be able to salvage this show after all.
For the record, nobles preferred living in rich, comfortable houses called manor houses. But remember, being a noble meant controlling lots of land and the people who lived on the land. To do this, the noble needed a strong, fortified base. So yes, for a long time, a lot of nobles lived in castles.
You'll have to excuse the mess. The set is under construction. Let's get the lowdown on how these castles were built.
Around the year 800, the first castles were wooden forts. A single tower on a high mound called a motte, surrounded by a wooden or earthen wall called a bailey. Between the years 1000 and 1100, lords began building castles out of stone, and then additions and improvements were made. Castles became the key to controlling lots of territory. During the next 350 years, defenses became stronger and living inside became more comfortable. That's when the castle was in its glory days. The outer wall was called the curtain wall. Towers were built so that the defenders of the castle could get a clear line of fire at anyone attacking any part of the curtain wall. Some castle walls were 20 feet thick. The most heavily defended part of the castle was the gatehouse, usually with several towers and openings in the floor to shoot arrows or pour boiling water or oil on anyone trying to break down the gate. The building inside the walls was called the keep. It was designed so that even if attackers got over the wall, the towers, and the gatehouse, soldiers inside the keep could still hold out. The keep was where the lord and his family lived. Castles did their job, and very few were attacked by assaulting armies. The attacking army had to put the castle under siege, which meant they had to surround it and wait for the people inside to starve. A siege might last 2 years, and sometimes it was the attackers who gave up because there was less food outside than inside the castle. The old castles were so strong, many stood up to the guns and bombs of war and are still standing today. Tell you what, boss, why don't we just walk through a typical day for a noble in one of these castles?
Oh, all right. Just try to make it interesting, okay?
We beat you to it. Why don't we go a few rounds, huh, boss? Whenever we see a way for a noble to show off his power, we'll hear a bell. Little things we take for granted today could have been a big deal in the Middle Ages. When it was time for a noble to rise and shine, a lord or lady was lucky to rise from a bed. Only the rich and powerful could afford a bed in the Middle Ages, and it was the most expensive piece of furniture in the house. Nobles, and even kings and queens, would often have their beds taken apart and moved with them when they went from place to place. A bed was a big mark of power.
So what's next?
They get dressed. Do we have that noble guy ready to go?
Oh, stand by.
Stand by.
Go, you're on.
What you see here is what I wear on a typical day around the castle. There's a short tunic, a long tunic, and hose on my legs. Very fashionable. This is called a mantle, and notice this material. Not just anyone can afford these things. Silk, velvet, brocade, only the finest. My wife wears clothes very similar to this. If you wonder why we need to be this dressed up just around the house, remember, it's cold and damp in a big stone castle, even in summertime. One more thing I'd like you to notice. I'm especially proud of these nice colors. Colors are a mark of nobility. We're the only ones wearing colors like scarlet and green. For one thing, we can afford the dye. For another, it's against the law for anyone who isn't a noble to wear these colors. You have to keep those peasants in their place, you know.
So once they were up and dressed, some noble lords and their families would hear a mass in their private chapel. Religion was a big part of the lives of some people in the Middle Ages. Then the noble went about his work, managing his lands, as did his wife. What about the kids? Well, if they were more than 7 or 8 years old, chances are they would be elsewhere. That's the way it worked in noble families. How would you like it?
When they were little, a noble's children could play with toys like wooden swords or soldiers and board games. But by the time he was 8, a boy could be sent off to work as a page in the castle of another noble. As a page, he learned things like good manners, how to serve food at a table, to dance, and to play popular games like chess.
Boys and girls were taught to read, and girls were also taught math so that they could manage household accounts when they grew up. A noble's son was taught by a tutor or a priest who lived with the family in the castle. By the time he was 12, a boy started out learning his profession, maybe learning about weapons and riding a horse, or maybe he would enter a monastery and become a monk. A girl would attend a school run in a nunnery if she was to become a nun. It cost money to be accepted as a monk or a nun, so mostly children of noble families filled those roles. Otherwise, the only job for a girl was to marry the man that her father had selected for her. Nobles built up their estates and their power by arranging marriages for their kids. And girls might even end up getting married by the time that they were 14 years old, or even as young as 12.
A lot of work went on inside this castle, but the real work that makes the whole thing function was done out there. A noble was rich because he controlled lots of land. The descendants of a noble would inherit land, money, and nobility too. The land was only valuable if there was someone to work on it. On a noble's estate, that someone was usually a serf, a person whose ancestors gave up their freedom in exchange for the right to live and work on a noble's land. And if your ancestors were serfs, you were a serf. Once a serf, always a serf. Now watch how this works. The serf worked on the land grew crops, and it supported cows, sheep, and pigs. The crops and animals supported the people of the castle. And at the very top of it all was the noble lord. The serf was the foundation for it all, but the lord controlled the serfs. So while they were the source of his wealth, wealth was the key to his power. So he was powerful, rich, and lived better than most in the Middle Ages. But you wouldn't believe some of the stuff the noble and his family considered to be luxuries in the great big castle. Okay, let's see our noble guy again.
A lot of effort is put into keeping the castle clean and comfortable. See all these dried plant stems scattered on the floor? They're called rushes and are laid on the floor so that we don't always walk on cold stone. And the rushes catch trash and table scraps and are swept out every once in a while. You could even maybe toss in some mint or a bouquet of daisies. Oh, thanks. To freshen the place up.
They did their best to cover the smell, but here's how one person described what else got mixed up with those rushes on the floor. An ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty. Ugh. While we're on the subject of nasty, running water wasn't usually an option, so the toilet was often a sort of closet cut into the outer wall. They called it a guard-robe. It opened on a shaft that dropped into a pit all the way down at the foot of the wall. No toilet paper was provided, but a thoughtful host would make sure you didn't run out of nice fresh straw in the guard-robe.